Patricia has done. I want to do a series of lectures today for you on the theology of humor, and the humor of Jesus, the humor of the Old Testament, and humor for your life today. And before we start, I want to lead us in a prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for the fact that we're here together today, and I just pray that you'll bless our thoughts and some of the things we try to think through together about a very interesting, fun, and exciting topic, and to try to understand the meaning of humor, of mirth, and its sources. And so, Lord, bless us today as we think together and enjoy one another together too. In Christ's name we pray, amen. I produced a little freebie, a little gift for you, which unfortunately was not supposed to be handed out until the end of the day, because I don't want you leafing through my favorite musicals during my lecture. So do not read this now. But somehow somebody broke into the pile and started distributing these. So if you did get them, you should feel very guilty. If you didn't, you can get them at lunch. I produced The Humor of Jesus, the 20th Century Reflection, the Earl Palmer Humorous List Center. And I have produced the 12 funniest writers I've ever read, the 12 funniest comedians I've ever seen. This was to be just a little fun gift to you at the end of the day, and now, lo and behold, you got it. See, Berkeley is a feisty town. The fact that that pile said, wait, do not distribute, believe me, that's the best way to get anything distributed in Berkeley. You know, how do you like that? And then I produced the 12 funniest movies I've ever seen, and then the 12 greatest, I decided just to throw in as a freebie, the 12 greatest Broadway London musicals I've ever seen. That doesn't mean they're the greatest, but it's the ones I've seen. And at the end of the day, I'll even defend this list. I produced this, I taught this class in Seattle. They didn't have to pay. In fact, I was telling someone, you know, I'm going to teach my class on humor down in Berkeley all in one day. I did it for 5 consecutive Wednesday nights in Seattle. I had 1,000 people there, and it was an hour and a half each session. So I'm paring it down a little bit today. You're lucky for that. But I did it up there, and I produced this list for Seattle. So that's why it says of the 20th century, because now we're in the 21st century. I should have updated it. But we just reproduced it for you. I did it in Seattle and had a lot of fun. And I tell you, I had to defend this list because I got email. Because I gave the list out the week before the end of the class, and I got email of people protesting things that I put on, protesting omissions. So I've got a huge list now of my people up there, their favorites. And it was really fun. So we had a lot of fun over this list even. And but you have it now. And if you don't have it, you'll get it at lunch. All right. And my good friend Jan Armstrong is videotaping today. He has videotaped me at Mount Hermon, and when I'm at Mount Hermon, he videotapes me, and his company is called Essential Media, which videotapes Presbyterians usually. And Tony Campolo. I guess you do branch out with Tony Campolo, and he has done that, and so he's Presbyterian minister from San Luis Obispo, and tremendous guy who was once an intern in this church, where he learned everything about video and everything. Oh, everything he knows. No, everything good that he knows. No, but he was one of our interns here when I was a pastor at this church. So it's great to have Jan, a young man that's made good, and I have a chance to not only be on audio tape, but be a star of stage, screen, and radio. But I'm going to be on the video too. It's funny, he's videoed me at Mount Hermon, and one year I did the book of Philippians at Mount Hermon, and they videoed it, and people all over the country looked at that video. And you know how Mount Hermon has a great quotation up in the thing, behind you when you speak? And all through the video of my entire series on Philippians, only 1/2 of the quotation was visible on the screen, and so people all over the country said, what is the rest of that quotation? I said, you have to write Mount Hermon for that. All right. I have a quotation to start with. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you on a journey through theology of humor. And I'm going to also give you some little gifts at the end of each of our sessions before our breaks. And that is, I'm going to actually do some humorous readings too. Like when I've taught C.S. Lewis, I've done readings from Lewis as a sort of a gift. And so I have some little gifts for you of readings that are very funny readings that will just be little off-the-wall gifts. So therefore I've got to keep my eye on my watch so that I can save time before every break and give you those readings. I'll start out with a very important reading from Gilbert Keith Chesterton. In 1909, one of the funniest writers there is Gilbert Keith Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, a very important influence on C.S. Lewis. Chesterton, who became a Christian in about 1909 as a young man, became a Roman Catholic Christian. In fact, he's had a tremendous influence as a Catholic apologist. And anyway, when he became a Christian, he wrote a book called Orthodoxy to try to explain how he became a believer. In 1909, I think it's an absolute masterpiece. In fact, all my children, when they turned 21, I gave them a copy of Orthodoxy. I felt that was the one book I wanted to give each of my kids, was Orthodoxy, by G.K. Chesterton. A little later, in 1925, he wrote a book called The Everlasting Man. And that book, C.S. Lewis said, was the finest book on the Christian faith he ever read. It's this wonderful, whimsical treatment of who we are and who Christ is. And then he wrote novels and many detective stories, the Father Brown detective stories, a whole bunch of detective stories he wrote. And also, he was a journalist who wrote, in fact, I've collected Chesterton. I have all of his columns he wrote for the London Standard, these newspapers. And so he was quite a flamboyant, amazing man, about 6'6" in height, about 300 pounds, huge man, wore a cape, had a little glasses with a chain. I mean, he was really something. And anyway, this is the way he ends Orthodoxy. The mass of men have been forced to be gay. This is when gay was an innocent word, when he's using it. Have been forced to be gay about the little things, but sad about the big ones. Nevertheless, I offer my last dogma defiantly. It is not native to man or woman to be so. Man is more himself, man is more manlike, womanlike, when joy is the fundamental thing in him, and grief the superficial. Melancholy should be an innocent interlude, a tender and fugitive frame of mind. Praise should be the permanent pulsation of the soul. Pessimism is at best an emotional half-holiday. Isn't that interesting? Joy is the uproarious labor by which all things live. And then he ends with this strange ending to the book. Joy, which is the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. And as I close this chaotic volume, I open again the strange small book from which Christianity came, in other words, the Bible. And I am again haunted by a kind of confirmation. The tremendous figure which fills the Gospels towers in this respect, as in every other, above all the thinkers who ever thought themselves tall. His pathos was natural, almost casual. The Stoics, ancient and modern, were proud of concealing their tears. Jesus never concealed his tears. He showed them plainly on his open face at any daily sight, such as the far sight of his native city. Remember when Jesus wept over Jerusalem? Yet he concealed something. Solemn supermen and imperial diplomats are proud of restraining their anger. Jesus never restrained his anger. He flung furniture down the front steps of the temple, and he asked men how they expected to escape the damnation of hell. Yet he restrained something. I say it with reverence. There was in that shattering personality a thread that must be called shyness. There was something that he hid from all men when he went up the mountain to pray. There was something that he covered constantly by abrupt silence. There was some one thing that was too great for God to show us when he walked upon our earth, and I have sometimes fancied that it was his mirth. God has a sense of humor. He's the first one with a sense of humor. Did Chesterton surprise you? He always does. He's a great one-liner. He has this great line, "We have sinned and grown old. Our Father is younger than we are." God is younger than we are. He hasn't sinned and grown old. We've sinned and grown old. He is younger than we are. He has mirth. And I just love that. That's how we'll start our class today. Mirth. What is mirth? Where do we find it in the Bible? Chesterton says it's sort of hidden, so we're going to have to look for it. What role does it play, both good and bad, in life? Mirth, humor. Why is good humor important for us today? All right, first of all, I want to give you a few thoughts on the way to understand the dynamics and the goals of humor. First of all, the dynamics of humor. What are the kinds of humor? The dynamics. C.S. Lewis, in a chapter I'll read you later in more detail, says that he defines laughter or humor as a sudden perception of incongruity. The sudden perception of incongruity. And that's the first dynamic of humor. President Ronald Reagan was a very funny man. When he went to China to visit, when the paramount leader was Deng Xiaoping, they went down to see the terracotta warriors. They had just been unearthed. These tremendous 1,000 soldiers standing, all made of terracotta, and they were there. And if you go to China, you're taken. If you're an important dignitary, you're taken to see them. Al Gore, our vice president, was taken. Unfortunately, Al Gore does not have a sense of humor. It's true, when he was in Seattle, he came to see the sinkhole. We had this huge sinkhole. And the vice president was there to see this sinkhole that had already taken 3 houses into it, and they were vanished. And he said, the press is all waiting. What are you going to say, Al Gore? And he said, that is really something. That was the soundbite. And that's hurting Al Gore. His wife is trying to help him out on that score. But President Ronald Reagan, when he saw the terracotta warriors, when Al Gore saw them, he said, wow, this is really impressive. He wrote that down. President Reagan was standing there with Deng Xiaoping and looked at the terracotta warriors. And Deng Xiaoping said, what do you think? There's something. And President Reagan said, at ease. Soldiers were all like this at attention. And the Chinese loved it. They repeat that over and over again, how President Reagan said, at ease. It's a joke. That's mirth. It's a sudden perception of incongruity. Al Gore said, it's impressive. Al, we need a joke. We need a joke. I like Al Gore, but he needs to loosen up. And anyway, President Reagan had that marvelous ability to see the humor in something, and he made a lot of the jokes about himself. And he said at ease. And that was a joke. That's the sudden perception of incongruity. That's the surprise in humor. The surprise is basic to humor. Secondly, there's a second kind of humor, and that's the humor of repetition. You're going to see a lot of that in the Old Testament because the Jewish method of writing is called parallelism, where the Jews always love to say something once and then say it a second time. And very often the second telling of it is funny. The second choice of the way something is told often introduces a humorous angle. You'll see that because I'm going to give you some Old Testament examples of humor in a few moments. But repetition is funny. It's funny how great comedians who are the masters of comedy know how to play this card. If you think of Jack Benny, who I list in my list as one of the great comedians because of his timing, but also Jack Benny was the master of repetitious humor. He developed characters that were so knowable in his shows, his radio show, and he himself was so knowable, and things about him were so knowable, that after a while, all he had to do was repeat some aspect of his personality, and you laughed. His tightwad, the fact that he was a tightwad, the fact that his relationship with Rochester, his relationship with Mary Livingston, all these various, they didn't have to bring up new items to make you laugh. They repeated things that you already knew. And that became a masterstroke aspect of Jack Benny's humor. Mel Blanc was the voice for Jack Benny for many of his characters, and one of the funniest scenes in Jack Benny was Jack Benny walking on the street one day, and a thug comes up behind him and says, and it's Mel Blanc's voice, but Mel Blanc says, "Buddy, your money or your life?" And there's silence. And then he repeats it to Jack Benny. He says, "Did you hear me? I said your money or your life." And there's silence. And then finally he says, "Listen, I'm telling you, I mean it. Your money or your life." And Jack Benny said, I'm thinking. I mean, you laughed because you knew he was tight. And you knew that money was so important to Jack Benny. Actually, he was a very generous man in life. But he created that persona. So all you had to do was to repeat that, and it was funny. Jerry Seinfeld is the master of this. With one line, now with Jerry Seinfeld, though his show is over, all he has to do I just saw one of his shows that follows after the Seinfeld was over, is Jerry Seinfeld as a stand-up comedian. And at the end, he took questions from the audience as to what they wanted and things they wanted to hear. And guess what they wanted him to say? And that's how he ended his show, with something that's just a repetitious humor from the Seinfeld show. It's the way Jerry Seinfeld says, "Hello, Newman." It's funny. Newman is a character that they established in the show. And all Jerry Seinfeld has to say is, "Hello, Newman." And the way he says it, nobody else can say it the same way. And it becomes funny. It's repetitious humor. Another kind of humor is the humor of misunderstanding. It plays a big part in the Bible. I'll show you when we get to New Testament humor. A lot of our Lord's humor is the humor of misunderstanding. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. They misunderstood him. And in that is something that they used to charge against Christ, but it's also one of the humorous elements in what Jesus said. He meant his body. They thought he meant the temple. But humor of misunderstanding is a very big kind of humor. My favorite humorist of all is Mark Twain. Nobody is in his league, in my opinion. And Mark Twain, in Huckleberry Finn, which is his greatest novel, has this wonderful scene of Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River. And Huck is a bad boy, of course, and they've already established his character that he tells lies, and he's in trouble with everybody. And his dad is a terrible man and a drunkard and all, and he's kind of running away. And Jim is a runaway slave. And Huck and he are going down the river together. And one of the great scenes in fact, floating down the Mississippi is the great part of Huckleberry Finn. That's the great part of the book. And while they're floating down, some men come up in a boat that are bounty hunters looking for runaway slaves. And they see this raft coming down. They think, it might be a runaway slave on that raft. And so these bounty hunters shout out to, and Huck is sitting up, Jim is lying low. And they shout out to Huck and they say, "Hey boy, is there a runaway slave on that boat? On that raft, We're coming to look." And Huck has to make a quick decision. And Mark Twain, in his wonderful, wonderful humor of Mark Twain, has Huck say this to the boat as it comes up. "Hey, misters, will you come and help me? My pappy's here and he's got the smallpox. Help me, please." And the bounty hunters say, "Hey, you go on down the river, boy, and they'll help you down below." And they go off. That's the humor of misunderstanding. They thought there was smallpox in the boat. Instead, there's a runaway slave in the boat. And it was Huck. And by the way, Huck felt guilty about telling that lie afterward, too. He said, "Well, there's one more thing I've done wrong. It's telling a lie." But he just did the right thing. And the humor of Mark Twain is just absolutely marvelous. It's the humor of misunderstanding. Then there's the humor of exaggeration. We call that hyperbole in the Bible. You're going to see a lot of that when we look at the Old and New Testament. Examples of humor, the humor of exaggeration. I think one of my list of funniest movies was Harpo and Chico and Groucho Marx, the Night of the Opera. They were the masters of slapstick, certainly, but they were always a cut above. Their slapstick was always a cut above. There was kind of a philosophical element in all of the Marx Brothers' humor. And one of the funniest scenes, exaggeration scenes in the Marx Brothers, is Harpo, who never says a word, you know. He's the silent one in the Marx Brothers. He plays the harp, but he doesn't say anything. But he has this tremendously expressive face, pantomime face. And in one of the funniest scenes that I think is in The Night of the Opera, Harpo is standing leaning against the wall, like this. And people come up to him, and one guy says, "Hey, stupid, what are you doing, holding up the wall?" And Harpo says, "Yeah." Because he never speaks, you know. And then another guy comes up and says, "Hey, stupid, what are you doing, holding up the wall?" He smiles. Then a third guy comes up and says, "Hey, stupid, what are you doing, holding up the wall?" And he leaves. And then Harpo walks away and the wall falls down. The whole building falls down. I mean, that's slapstick. It's total exaggeration. It couldn't happen. And it becomes a big element in the sudden perception of incongruity. This whole wall being held up by Harpo Marx. I mean, it's impossible. And yet it fell. Then there's the humor of irony. And that's the most sophisticated and subtle of all the humor forms. And we're going to see that also in the Old and New Testament passages that we're going to look at. The humor of irony. Bob Hope, it seems to me, is a good example of the humor of irony. Do you know that he entertained American troops from World War II right straight through to Desert Storm when he was almost in his 90s when he entertained in Desert Storm? This amazing man who every single Christmas went to the front during wartime to entertain American troops. He was quite something. He's still alive, you know. He's 100 years old now, Bob Hope. And in his own league. I saw a special on Bob Hope on Channel 9, our public television. It's a wonderful biography of Bob Hope. It's a 2-hour special. And it brought tears to your eyes, as they took him through all these, he always went to these hospitals to see these folks, guys that were wounded, and went and did these shows, always had his golf club, you know, his sort of a signature, stand up there, and he'd have these beautiful Hollywood women, and then Jerry Colonna, his character who was with him, and he went and visited these troops. And during the Vietnam War, they had the most moving footage for me was during the Vietnam War when he was over in Da Nang doing this big show in Christmas, and all these young men were out there, and the generals and others were there. And Bob Hope stood up and was entertaining them. Of course, he had his golf club, and joking with them, and he said, "Hey, fellas, I just want you guys to know that everybody back home is 50% behind you." And everybody just roared with laughter. What a healing laugh it was for those guys to face up to that reality. You know, there were no praise given to Vietnam veterans when they came home. We gave World War II vets praise, but those guys went over there and fought. They didn't want to fight. And we never said thank you. We paid a heavy price for that. I'm glad there's a Vietnam memorial now. The most visited memorial in Washington now is a Vietnam memorial. I'm glad. But we didn't do it right. And Bob Hope, he stuck by those guys. But he called a spade a spade. And with humor, he helped them to diffuse some of their bitterness, maybe, with that wonderful line. You know, you expect him to say, "I want you guys to know that everybody back home is 100% behind you right now." But they weren't. And so he won't say that. Being a good comedian, he said, "I want you guys to know that everybody back home is 50% behind you." Isn't that marvelous? 50%. And that's humor. Notice, it's the humor of irony. And you laugh. Okay, now what's the goal of humor? I want us to understand the goal of mirth when you encounter it. Because first of all, there are some bad goals of mirth. And I'm not going to talk about those today. But if I were going to do and I am writing a book on humor, and I've devoted a whole 2 or 3 chapters in the book to bad humor, the humor of evil. There is evil humor. It's the humor of despair, it's the humor of cruelty, and the humor of isolation. But I'm not talking about that today, because I'm talking today about good humor. But there is a lot of bad humor. I think one of the most important musicals, I did not put it on my top 12 list, because I don't think it's that good, but it was a very important musical called Cabaret. It's now making a revival, coming back. It's on Broadway again. Joel Grey played masterfully, the master of ceremonies, in the original Cabaret. Liza Minnelli did the movie version of Cabaret. I saw it on stage, and I saw it in the movie too. It was a great musical. It's a terrifying musical. It's an evil musical. And the master of ceremonies is the devil. And he's terribly funny. But all the humor is designed to harm. And finally, of course, to harm the Jews. He makes fun of the Jews in the stage. The whole setting is Berlin in the early 30s. And he is seductive. Life is a cabaret. Come to the cabaret. And the whole thing is evil to the core. And you realize it's scary how sometimes evil can be so funny. But the purpose is cruel. It's like sometimes in a schoolyard, some jokes that are told to kids are told to harm them, to isolate them. If you saw the news last night, a young man in San Francisco put an evil email on a college campus. Was that San Francisco State? Or where he said that all handicapped people should be punished, and he said, here's a good way to do it. Do something to their carriages, to their wheelchairs. And he did it as a joke, he said. They caught him because, you can't get away with anything on the email now. They have a record of everything. I heard a speech on the email at Rotary, and they said, don't put anything on the email you don't want a jury to hear. He was saying that to businessmen because there is no way to erase anything on the email, and they can find out where you are. Well, they found out where that guy was immediately, and he's now confessed and said, I'm sorry, I only meant it as a joke. He made fun of handicapped people. But he did it in a way to isolate them. It was cruel. It was hostile. It was out for the kill, though he said it was all just a joke. And he wants to protect it by the First Amendment. That you have a right. No, you don't have a right to do that. But there is a kind of humor that can be the humor of the cabaret, a master of ceremonies. A humor designed to harm, to isolate, and to injure. And I don't want to go into that. Then there's also good mirth, and that's what I want to spend our time on today. Good mirth, but I had to bring that up to tell you that not all laughter is good. There is laughter that can be cruel. And therefore, you have to check yourself and find out what you're laughing at. I always say that to parents, if I can make one last comment on this. I always say to parents when you're raising children, a family needs traditions when kids are growing up. And I'll tell you a good tradition a family can have, and that is, we have this tradition in our family. We don't laugh at racist jokes in our family. It's not our family tradition. And that'll sometimes help a kid when they're in a situation where racist jokes are told and they don't decide not to laugh. Oh, that's not our family tradition. We don't laugh at racist jokes. We don't laugh at jokes that make fun of human beings for who they are. I don't want to laugh at those. Sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes you're caught up in it. But we set a tradition to try to focus your life on what's good humor and joyous humor. But there is bad humor out there, and you need to face up to it. All right, there's good mirth. And what does the good mirth do? The goal of good mirth is to help me to connect myself to other human beings. And it does. Humor is a wonderful way in which we're connected to each other, and I'll show you that in the Old and New Testament too. Also, humor helps me find myself. In this sense, humor plays a good judgment role in the good sense of the word of judge. The word krino, to judge, means to weigh. It helps me weigh myself and see who I am and where I'm coming from. So it also can play that role of helping me find myself. And sometimes that's a little bit on the painful side, but the humor helps me to be able to do it. And I have a Garrison Keillor piece I'm going to read to you later, where Garrison Keillor is the master, modern Mark Twain, in helping us do that. I've been to every Garrison Keillor show I can go to and watch him live and in person. And of course, I listen to Prairie Home Companion whenever I can on Saturday afternoon. But he has this marvelous way of helping you find yourself and see your foibles and see the shallowness in your life and also where you're hurting and all the rest. And he does it humorously and yet you don't know whether you're crying or laughing at the same time. And that's a great humorist, helping you find yourself. And then humor is healing. It disarms painful wounds. I think that's Bob Hope's joke, 50% of America is behind you. You know, the guys in Vietnam on that Christmas show needed to laugh. And they needed to laugh, at that too. It needed to have that disarmed. Get it out and let's show it for what it is. But let's be able to laugh at it. It disarms painful wounds. And it disarms fear, reduces the power of the forces that bring dread. Now, that is the most subtle, and I'm going to save the big insight for that as we get toward the end of our day today. But there is something about humor that is very frightening to the forces of evil. Martin Luther said, "The devil cannot bear to be laughed at." He has no sense of humor. He cannot bear to be laughed at. So if he will not yield to texts of scriptures, mock him. He cannot endure that. I think one of the great scenes in J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is the very end, the last novel, the last of the trilogy, where Sam Gamgee and Frodo are on the Dark Tower in the most harrowing part of that story. Because they have this dreadful ring. Well, Frodo has the dreadful ring. And if you haven't read Lord of the Rings, I tell you, you're in for a great treat. My son announced me the other day he's going to read it every year for the rest of his life, the whole 3-volume work. He loves it so much. And Ann and I drove across the country a couple of years ago, and we've all read it a couple times, and we decided, hey, what are we going to read on the trip across the country? So we read Lord of the Rings again. It's such a great story. Tolkien was the man who led C.S. Lewis to Jesus Christ. Great Catholic Christian. Marvelous. Anyway, this horrible ring is so powerful, and Frodo has it. And he's got to make a major decision about it because it has a tenacious, clinging power because it's so powerful. He wants to hold on to it, and yet he's got to get rid of it and throw it into this fire. But anyway, they're on this dark tower at the most dangerous moment because they're getting so close to the power of Sauron's power is so great. And Sam Gamgee says to Frodo, while they're sitting up there, he said, Master Frodo, he just loves Frodo. And Sam Gamgee says to Master Frodo, they're going to be telling stories about us back at the Shire. And what they're going to do when they tell stories about us, they're going to say about now Master Frodo and his good friend Sam Gamgee. They're going to tell stories about us. And at that point, when Frodo hears that, he breaks out laughing. At the thought of the Shire telling stories about Frodo and his good friend, Mr. Sam Gamgee. And Frodo starts to laugh. And guess what happens? There is an earthquake on that mountain. Because as Tolkien says, laughter had never been heard on that mountain. The laughter threatened Sauron, the power of evil. And folks, you're going to see when we get to the end of our day today that joy is the fourth of the great words. Faith, hope, love, joy. And joy will terrify evil. And that's what those two young men were experiencing, was joy. And it caused an earthquake on that mountain. That's something? So there's the power of humor to disarm evil. Why? Because it shows that evil is not so permanent. Evil is never ultimate. Like Karl Barth says, evil can never do ultimate mischief. It can only do mischief, but not ultimate mischief. And once I know that, I can laugh at evil. It's boundary. And that is disarming the power of evil. And then there is the humor of love, faith, and hope. And finally, the humor of joy. And we'll talk about those because they're all the good humors that we have to look forward to. Love, faith, hope, and joy.